Well, China, mainland China, People's Republic of China, has long claimed that there's only one China, that Taiwan is a part of that China, and that China is the People's Republic of China, and therefore Taiwan is a renegade, illegal province, in essence, defying the will of the central government. Taiwan has claimed that, well, has had a more complicated attitude toward the idea of one China, but hasn't rejected that idea. But in any case, its original position was that, it was the legitimate government of all of China, and now it claims to be the Republic of China, Taiwan. That's been its long standing proposition. And in any case, it is a society that has become a democracy that values freedom and is probably most liberal democracy in Asia, that doesn't want to be forcibly absorbed by a neo-totalitarian regime. And the more that the People's Republic of China presses its demand for recognition of it as the only legitimate government with sovereignty not only over the mainland and of course of Hong Kong and Macau and so on, but also over Taiwan, the more the people of Taiwan feel threatened and feel violated in terms of their right to democratic self-determination. And the assertion of democratic self-determination within the framework of the Republic of China, Taiwan, has increasingly frustrated China's neo-totalitarian leader, Xi Jinping, who has been speaking along with other Chinese leaders in an increasingly bellicose and belligerent way, and acting in an increasingly bellicose and belligerent way in terms of the violation of Taiwan's airspace, its air identification zone, its territorial waters, the obstruction of any Taiwan participation in international forums, even in an international forum like the World Health Assembly that implies no condition for statehood in order to participate. So this has led not only to a continuing deadlock over the status of Taiwan, but a drift on the part of the People's Republic of China to language and actions that increasingly threaten violence in order to resolve the question. The worry that many American scholars, observers, and policymakers have increasingly is that the controversy over Taiwan could lead to military conflict, not only between Taiwan and mainland China, but between mainland China, the People's Republic of China, and the United States. And any violent conflict would be a tragedy for all concerned and should be avoided, in every possible way. But the problem is that the drift toward violent confrontation is mainly being driven by PRC threats, intimidation, as I said, belligerence, and provocation, the growing intrusion of large numbers of Chinese fighter planes into Taiwan's air identification zone, and the growing belligerence on the part of the People's Republic of China toward other fishing vessels and other naval vessels in the South China Sea, with China's unilateral claim in violation of international law, that it has sovereignty over the entire South China Sea. So on the one hand, we need to avoid rhetoric and actions and attitudes that could contribute to a polarizing dynamic that could lead to, or an accident that could lead to actual military conflict. On the other hand, we can't, as a community of free states, simply ignore what the PRC is doing and say, fine, you can decide who can traverse the South China Sea. You can decide what Taiwan's status should be. You can decide who can fly and ship where, anywhere in the region. We can't accept that, or the entire Indo-Pacific region will simply become a sphere of Chinese domination. The United States has a policy that leaves ambiguous the question of what the United States would do in the event of military hostilities over the Taiwan Straits. We've made it clear that we don't want to be boxed in and have our ability to make decisions about national and international security dictated by any other actor on this matter. And also, I think we've made clear that we're trying to act with restraint and not alter the status quo in a way that the People's Republic of China would see as provocative. For these reasons, I think the overwhelming majority of American, that is US national security planners, policymakers, thinkers, strategists, continue to favor this policy of strategic ambiguity. At the same time, I think there's a growing consensus that we need to project more military deterrent force into the East Asia Pacific region, and that we need to help Taiwan and partner with Taiwan to develop a defense strategy that is appropriate to the times and to the growing danger that you have described, and to the increasing asymmetry in the total amount of power, of military power, military resources, military ships, personnel, and weaponry that each side can deploy. There's no denying the increasing asymmetry and imbalance in the military power across the two sides of the Taiwan Strait. For this reason, I and many of my colleagues who have looked at this question strongly endorse the policy initiative of some actors in Taiwan that has been labeled an overall defense concept. And the overall defense concept is a concept of asymmetric defense. Instead of concentrating all of Taiwan's defensive and deterrent military capacity on very expensive, high-tech, and large-scale and slow to develop and deliver weapon systems, advanced fighter aircrafts and advanced tanks and so on, we urge a more total, flexible, distributed, and asymmetric system of defense that involves the deployment of a lot of smaller, more mobile, but very lethal weapon systems, mines, small ships, missiles, shoulder-fired missiles, and information warfare, and other defense mechanisms that are less vulnerable to elimination in a first strike by the People's Liberation Army. Because the more you have of a lot of small things, the more difficult it is for those things to be completely taken out in a first strike. And the more that the PRC would have to weigh the consequences of an invasion in terms of large-scale sinking of their ships and possibly loss of a lot of their soldiers and sailors and even airmen and women. So having this, what's also called porcupine strategy, of the rapid acquisition and deployment of a lot of small, more mobile, very lethal, and sophisticated small things, is a way of bolstering Taiwan's defense while acknowledging the vast asymmetry in overall power, overall military power between the two sides. There's a danger with AUKUS, this partnership between the US, UK, and Australia. There's a danger in the Quad relationship, the quadrilateral strategic dialogue that brings together the US, Japan, Australia, and India. There's a similar danger to each of these two overlapping initiatives. But the danger is not the one that you articulated. There is zero possibility that the United States or any of the other four strategic and diplomatic partners or interacting states that are involved in these groupings, there's zero chance that any of them would now or would at some point in the future, short of massive PRC, military provocation, recognize the independence of Taiwan. That is not going to happen. And indeed, I think the president of Taiwan, a remarkable leader, Tsai Ing-wen, and the bulk of the people of Taiwan, and certainly a nearly unified American strategic, military, diplomatic, and political leadership, all recognize that any fundamental alteration of the political status quo around Taiwan would be extremely dangerous and destabilizing. The people of Taiwan favor the status quo in terms of what Taiwan is and its relationship to the mainland, and the United States government and supporting foreign policy thinkers and advisors strongly favor the status quo as well. I think personally that would be a huge and tragic miscalculation on the part of the PRC leadership. First of all, if they seek by military force to annex Taiwan, there's a very good chance that they would not only fail, but suffer huge military losses in failing. Second of all, it could lead to all-out war between China and the United States, in which neither side would really emerge in a very enviable or desirable situation. And third, whether China won or lost from this, whether it was successful or not, and independent of the probable significant military losses that Beijing would incur, the Chinese economy would be ruined by this, because it would be crossing a massive red line in terms of international peace and security, that would bring merciless sanctions on the Chinese government, and unfortunately on the Chinese people as well, even though they would have not been to blame for the decisions of their leaders. And the result would be a massive decoupling, I think, shocks to the international system, but most of all, a shock to the Chinese economy that could threaten the stability of Chinese communist rule, which is heavily conditioned on the successful economic performance of the Beijing government. So would they understand this in advance? I hope so. Is it being communicated clearly enough to Beijing leaders that the price they would pay for military action against Taiwan would be massive, irrespective of likely military costs and hostilities, a massive economic consequence? Is that being sufficiently communicated to them? No, I don't think it's being adequately, clearly communicated both to them and to the Chinese people. I think it needs to be communicated, but it needs to be communicated in a way that minimizes the degree to which it can be characterized as a threat. Keep in mind that Chinese nationalism is rising, in part because the government is stirring it, and in part for other reasons that have to do with the rise of identity politics all over the world. We want to avoid stirring Chinese nationalism and being seen to issue threats to China as a way of potentially continuing a long history of Western infliction of humiliation on China, is something we should be very cautious about. I don't know. It's a really interesting question. And I think probably the most interesting question is whether any further threat or resolve to act on Taiwan unilaterally will come out of that meeting. You know, we, I think, don't have a good track record of anticipating what Xi Jinping will do and what Chinese Communist Party leaders generally will do. We also don't have good visibility into the internal dynamics of the regime. And there may be public resolutions and decisions that come out of that meeting, and ones that don't become public very soon, but percolate through the system. There is a general presumption on the part of American China watchers and national security thinkers that the ultimate danger of PRC military action to unilaterally, quote, resolve, end quote, the Taiwan question is still years off. Admiral Davidson, the commander of the Indo-PACOM, Indo-Pacific Command for the United States based in Honolulu, has testified recently to Congress that he sees this danger reaching its peak period of crystallization within about 6 years. But we have a very astute and trenchant observer of the Chinese military and Chinese foreign and national security policy here at Stanford, Oriana Mastro, who has written an article recently in Foreign Affairs arguing that this could come to a head much sooner, within the next couple years. And I know that Oriana increasingly believes it could happen at any time. So I think that it would be a tragedy for China and for Taiwan and for the United States and for the world if Beijing were to resolve that time's up and it must now dictate what happens. But I don't dismiss the possibility that an eruption of military conflict or an acceleration of a path toward military conflict could happen much sooner than what people have been expecting or even now expect. And this is why I guess we're now concluding, so it's probably a good note to conclude on. This is why I think we need to act not only with maximum vigilance and clear resolve and energy to prepare for a more effective defense and to mount a more effective deterrent, but also to act with great restraint, verbal restraint, behavioral restraint, both on the part of Taiwan and on the part of the United States, so that more militant forces in China and more militant impulses in China are not given grounds to feel that they have been driven to action.